Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to everyone in person and online for being here for this event. We are very excited. We have wanted to do this for a very long time. So my name is Jeff Sebo. I am co-director of the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program alongside Becca Franks, who will be on the panel today. And so my role is just to welcome you to the event, tell you a little bit about what will be happening, and then introduce the moderator for the event today. So we are now going to be talking for about 75 minutes with folks here in the room and folks online about regulating the wild pet trade. And we have a lot of expertise in science and ethics and policy for the conversation, so it can be a wide-ranging, multidisciplinary conversation about a quite important practical problem. And so we will start with a facilitated conversation among our panelists, and then we will have time near the end to invite questions and comments, discussion from both the in-person and the online audience. So those of you who are here in person, you can wait until the time is right and raise your hand, and we can take you in whatever order the moderator prefers. And then for those of you who are tuning in online, you can put your questions and comments into the Q&A tab on Zoom at any time, and then we will weave those into the conversation, read them to the panelists during the conversation. Also, for people here in person, if you need to leave to go to the restroom, that is on the second floor. So go down the hall, up the stairs, and to the second floor, and you should be able to find it. Okay, now, it is my pleasure, first of all, to thank our co-sponsors. So thank you very, very, very much to World Animal Protection for co-sponsoring, co-hosting this event with us. We really, really appreciate it. Looking forward to working with you on this. And then second of all, to introduce the moderator, my colleague and frequent co-author, Adeline Manelli. Adeline is a senior fellow at NYU, where she collaborates with the Wild Animal Welfare Program, the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, and the Guarini Center at NYU Law. At the Wild Animal Welfare Program, she also serves as policy coordinator for our Wild Lab, which is a research policy lab that explores how we can improve wild animal welfare through local infrastructure change, in implementing thoughtful infrastructure changes for wild animals and then monitoring the effects so we can improve outcomes for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. Adeline brings specific expertise in both local and international environmental and animal law, and her current research explores how law and policy can be leveraged to advance wild animal welfare, with a special focus on urban environments and in the context of sustainable development and global governance. So please join me in welcoming Adeline Manelli.
Great, thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled to be moderating this discussion today. This is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, and so very, very excited to dive right into this conversation. We're very fortunate to be joined by three really incredible speakers from academia, from advocacy, as well as state government, who are going to help us unpack some of these issues today. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists now, and then we'll dive right into questions. So closest to me, to my right, is our very own Becca Franks. Becca is an assistant professor of environmental studies here at NYU, where her research focuses on animal behavior and welfare science. To Becca's right is Assemblymember Linda B. Rosenthal. Linda is a New York State Assembly member representing District 67 and a longtime leader on animal protection legislation in Albany. And to Linda's right is Liz Cabrera-Holtz. Liz is a senior campaigns manager at World Animal Protection US, where she oversees its campaign to end the exploitation of wild animals in the pet trade. So really fantastic panel, and thank you all so much for being here. So I guess to begin the conversation, I wanted to ask each of you to briefly share a little bit about yourselves and how your work intersects with the topic of wild pet ownership. What brought this issue to your attention, and why do you think it matters now, especially in a place like New York? And Becca, I guess we'll start with you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking interest in this issue. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. So as Adeline mentioned, I'm an animal welfare scientist. I am interested in both global patterns that affect animals and indicate what is happening to them, and I am also interested in specific individual animals and their welfare at the individual level. Within that, I focus mostly on aquatic animals and fishes, and for the purposes of the talk today, one of the things I really want to highlight is thinking about fish. The work that I do generically, that's not specifically related to this, but I think sets the stage, is I'm interested in their motivations, I'm interested in their emotions, I'm interested in their social relationships, and even their cultures. And all of those elements are best understood in wild populations where they have choice and control over how they live their lives and have the freedom of expression for all of those elements. And then, the intersection of that with my interest in this, wild pet issue came from a project I was working on years ago, looking at the wildlife trade and the imports into the US. And the numbers are staggering across multiple different taxa, but the most animals coming in are actually fishes from around the world. And across the United States, New York and our ports of entry are one of the biggest places where animals are coming in, and the majority of those animals are going to commercial purposes, that is the aquarium trade. And then the other thing that's important to think about when we're thinking about fishes, in addition to their complexity and their, personalities and the ways that they can be affected by captivity, is that they have totally different issues because they are aquatic animals. So transportation is difficult for any animal, humans included. Some of you I know have traveled to get here. It's, can be quite stressful. But for fish and aquatic animals, there is this major issue that is not faced by air-breathing animals. Water breathers, fishes, live in this environment that they have to get their oxygen from the water, and they also are constantly processing the aquatic environment into their body in a way that's not quite the same for terrestrial animals. So we're breathing in air, but we're mostly water. Fish are breathing in water and are mostly water. So the water quality of their environment impacts them dramatically in a way that's not quite true for air quality. So we have to think very differently about how they're being affected by these transport systems, and the water quality that is, essentially ruined in transport, and it is full of, their waste products, and then they're essentially poisoning themselves in the transport, and then that's depriving them of oxygen. And just to get the fish into New York City, into the United States, we're looking at really, really high mortality rates before you even see them as a potential pet for someone living in New York City. So there's a big backstory to what's happening with fish in particular for the wild pet trade.
Thank you. Thank you, Becca. Linda.
That was very interesting. I think life is hard for many of the more common wildlife animals, but fish, it seems even harder. I did grow up with a goldfish and a turtle, but now I have 2 kitties. So thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I was elected in 2006 to the New York State Assembly, and one of the first issues I read about was domestic abuse of people and their animals. And so I researched it, and I passed a law allowing companion animals to get orders of protection when their person got them. And that was the beginning, because I learned how all animals need protection under the law, and New York was not a leader, still not the leader, even though we've passed a lot of laws. And so I've introduced bills and passed bills about bears and cats and dogs and birds and lots of different animals. And I passed about 5 or 6 years ago a law to ban the declawing of cats And the origin of that was big cats, tigers. And there's a group called the Paw Project, which is about this, but that began when the vet ran into or was treating tigers that had been declawed. And so, like, it's a vast and varied field. Mostly I deal with companion animal laws, but I have a number of bills and a lot of concern about wildlife. The law doesn't consider them anyone's property, and animals are property in the law. So we have a long way to go, but I do have a bill on ending the sale of red-eared slider turtles and lots of other things. So happy to be here, happy to talk about animals all day.
Great. Liz?
Yes. So is this on? Yes? Okay, great. I'm an attorney and the senior campaigns manager at World Animal Protection. And for the last 5 years, my work has focused on wild animals in the U.S. pet trade and what I call expanded retail pet sales bans. So laws that prohibit the retail sale of animals that extend beyond puppies. I'm sure you've heard of puppy mill bans. Yes, yes, in New York, yes, puppy mill sales. And so most recently, we passed a law in West Hollywood that's the most expansive retail ban in the country and applies to mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, fishes, arachnids, and hermit crabs. And Assemblymember Rosenthal sponsored a bill this year to prohibit the sale of birds in pet stores, and we're working on a similar bill in New York City along with our partners at Voters for Animal Rights. And I think these laws are so critical, and the reason I got into it 5 years ago, I was coming from Animal Legal Defense Fund into this job, and so I knew a lot about puppy mill bans, and I was like, why do they not include more animals? Because most of the animals sold in the U.S. today are wild animals. They're not cats and dogs. So they're turtles, like red-eared sliders, bearded dragons, the small mammals like hamsters, gerbils, and then the small parrots like budgies. We call them parakeets in the U.S., songbirds like finches, and lots of fishes. So something that people don't realize is that the needs of these smaller wild animals are also quite significant. And whether you have a cockatoo or a lemur or a lion or a gerbil in your home, it's really hard to fully meet their needs. The other thing I wish people understood is that there aren't just puppy mills. So virtually all the animals you see sold in stores come from these huge commercial breeding mills. There are guinea pig mills, bearded dragon mills, and the mortality and suffering is extreme. So I think anything we can do to alleviate that suffering is worthwhile.
Thank you, Liz. So each of you have mentioned a variety of different animals in your opening remarks. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like what kind of wild animals are commonly held and kept as pets in New York, and are there any species that might be surprising to some?
Well, ferrets, and they're illegal to have here in New York City, but not the rest of the state. So I have a bill to prohibit the declawing and descenting of ferrets, because if you don't love everything about them, don't alter them for your pleasure. And so there's a place in the state that does that to ferrets. Birds, obviously, and we're working together on that. All manner of animals. Raccoons as well.
Yeah.
And, in New York State, the way raccoons are killed and other wildlife is any way someone wants to do it. Drowning, shooting, it's very hard to pass. And I'm trying, and others are trying to pass laws forbidding that kind of behavior, but it's really hard to get people to care about wild animals. It's not the same as a cuddly kitty or a cuddly puppy or a bunny. It's very difficult.
Sure. Yeah, Becca.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to talk about fish. So, this issue about getting people to care is really complicated too. So one of the things that happened after the film Finding Nemo is people started to care more about fish. And then what did that lead to? But a spike in people wanting to have clownfish as pets. And they're incredibly difficult animals to take care of in captivity. In addition to all of the water quality issues that I was mentioning before, they're marine species, so you also have to deal with the salinity levels and the evaporation of the water and the salinity changing as the water evaporates, and it's very, very hard to take good care of a fish. So I think that's one species that's worth mentioning. And then, more broadly speaking, fish often, we have this singular word for them, fish, but that is referring to 30,000 different species, which is the same number of species as land animals, with an equivalent amount of diversity in terms of their body shapes and their plans and their forms and their social relationships and their sizes and their colors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, one of the things that happens with the fish in particular is that people end up with many, many different species in their home in a way that's less true of, a lot of the terrestrial animals where, maybe you're like a dog person or a cat person. The fish people have many, many different species of fish in their homes usually. And they all have, different requirements to look after their well-being and their care. And some fish enthusiasts are really committed to that, but it's not, it's like a full-time job. It's not something that is easy to pick up or do well. And yet somehow there's an impression that like fish are somewhat expendable and then therefore it's okay that they die, rather than that being a signal of a failure of care. So I think that also just trying to get that level of specificity and understanding of the different species and their different needs and their diversity is really important for the fish as well.
Thank you, Becca. I think you get into a really important issue, which is, even with our best intentions, are there particular animals that are just not well suited to captivity, regardless of the type of environment that we can provide for them. But before I want to get into that question, I want to get to Liz. I know you had a couple of thoughts on the different types of animals that we could commonly find in New York, and maybe you have some thoughts on that as well.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that I don't think people would be terribly surprised to find out the most common animals in New York, because if you go to a Petco or PetSmart, those are the animals, because there's an industry behind it. So it's the same animals sold over and over again. The red-eared sliders. For frogs, it's often tomato frogs or Pac-Man frogs. For birds, it's budgies and finches, goldfishes. I think. And then, of course, in New York City, we do see macaws and Amazons being sold. They're being sold in Queens and the Bronx right now, which is a little unusual, but and those sales are usually legal. I think where I surprise people when I talk about this topic is with the small mammals, like the gerbils, the hamsters, the guinea pigs, the sale of guinea pigs. The retail sale of guinea pigs is actually illegal in the city now. But I would argue these are also wild animals, and I say that as a lawyer, not as a biologist or a veterinarian. But so hamsters, what you think of as a hamster is probably a golden or a Syrian hamster, and they've been bred in captivity for decades. But there are actually 15 species of free-roaming hamsters, free-living hamsters in Europe and Western Asia. And I don't see a big difference between those animals. I see a hamster, they're nocturnal, which surprises people. They're easily startled. We now know from research that they often have elevated stress hormones, which make them behave abnormally and prone to illness. They bite adults and children very freely and often. So, I push back against classifying those small mammals as a domestic companion, even though I know there's people with much longer academic histories than me who might disagree, but to me, these small mammals, I think, should also be considered wild.
Yeah, thank you.
As a scientist, I would agree with you.
So there's consensus. That's good. So I think you raised some important points, Liz, about the welfare concerns with keeping animals, like wild animals, in captivity. So I'm curious to just get yours and maybe Becca's thoughts on this, just to sort of dig into this issue a little bit more. Like, what are the main welfare concerns that we should be thinking about when keeping wild animals as pets, and how is that different from a domesticated animal like a cat or a dog? Why should we be thinking about them differently?
Sure, I can start with their kind of how the journey begins, which Becca started to talk about, with fishes. But again, these animals come from breeding mills. So just like puppy mills, they're being mass produced in these huge commercial facilities. And the welfare is quite low. We've seen from undercover investigations from animal groups, from accounts from employee whistleblowers, from USDA inspection reports that animals are enduring horrific suffering. So we see animals like with scabbing and eye abnormalities and diarrhea. We see cannibalization. We see deceased, decomposing animals among living animals. And we see animals unable to access food and water. And I think, and if you go species by species, you kind of uncover the unique horrors. So in parrot mills, they're not hundreds, they're thousands. I've seen as big as 8,000 at one facility. This is just a snapshot when you look at an inspection report from the USDA, 8,000 at a time. So thousands and thousands and thousands of parrots in these tiny, untreated wire cages. There's about 6 to 8 birds in each tiny cage, and they're stacked on top of one another in these really long rows in totally enclosed sheds and barns. And these are primarily in Oklahoma. And it's just not possible to meet a parrot's needs in those kind of situations. They look like hens in battery cages. It's really shocking to see what a parrot mill actually looks like. And I think on top of that, so that's terrible. Someone could look at that and say, that seems wrong. But on top of that, there's all these issues with parrots like parental deprivation. So removing babies from a parrot induces reproduction. So they do that. They remove them early because it's simply more profitable than allowing a parrot to raise their own baby. But the problem is parrots, in order to mature into a well-adjusted adult, you need your parent to teach you. So you have all these birds without their parents who are physically and psychologically unwell. And again, I think you could tell a similar story, a unique story for each species, but I do think parrots are particularly poorly suited for this model.
Thank you. Becca?
That was, really compelling information. I'll take a sort of zoomed out perspective. Defining animal welfare is an endless pastime for animal welfare scientists, but there's some general buckets, like you have to think about the biology of the animal, you have to think about their natural behavior, you have to think about their, subjective state, how they're feeling, their sort of internal psychology as well. So you have to think about these 3 different areas. You also have to think about not just preventing harm, but providing opportunities to have good experiences and positive experiences, and that includes positive relationships with others, which is a major source of deprivation. So you can have these sort of general principles, but actually achieving that for any particular animal, you need to know the species-specific issues. So like, if you know how to take care of a dog, it's not exactly the same as taking care of a cat. And I think that's like pretty easy for people to understand in terms of like the need to walk, the need to change the litter box. There's all of these species-specific issues, even though the principles are the same. And so you have to understand the species very, very well to provide good or even acceptable levels of care, in part because there's biological needs that you might not be meeting. You might be introducing biological harms. But also this issue of even understanding where abnormal behavior is occurring. If you don't understand the species at all, there's a possibility that you're not even going to know that they're behaving in an abnormal way. So this, seeing parrots feather plucking, for example, we know that that's abnormal because we're used to seeing parrots that have feathers, and we know that parrots should have feathers. But then if you're dealing with more and more unfamiliar animals, especially these aquatic animals and fishes, where we don't even know baseline what their natural behavior is, we don't even know like how they should be behaving, so we can't even identify the signals that there might be a severe welfare harm that then can lead into biological dysfunction and even death. So the familiarity and the specificity of the species and really understanding that incredibly well, that's not something a person can do by themselves. That's something that needs to be done with a community. And if that community is not there, there's no possibility of making it up. So there's essentially an impossibility of knowing how to provide good care if you don't know the species that well, and then not even knowing whether or not it's going wrong or not. So, when we're dealing with wild animals, especially these animals that we're not so familiar with, that lack of familiarity in and of itself is a major welfare risk for these animals.
Thank you, Becca. Liz, did you have okay. So we've talked about welfare risks for these animals. I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on risks, other types of risks, risk to public safety, risk to public health, especially in a dense city like New York. What are the risks to people, the environment, and health that we should be thinking about?
Well, if you want to see animals suffering up close and personal, you can go to a Petco and see the parakeets, plucking at each other and their feathers. But you can also go to a live market, and there are many live markets which are legal here in the city, where people come and pick a chicken, a goat, other animals that they want to eat, and it is very, very difficult to pass any legislation because you touch on a cultural nerve, and then the pushback is enormous. I have often called inspectors from the Department of Agriculture and Markets, as do many other activists, to come inspect those, because you can spread disease through these live markets, all different kinds of diseases that can also leap to humans, and you can explain the science behind that. So that is really an important part of the picture when it comes to dense urban environment. Are those, blood on the streets, chickens, dead chickens in cages with live chickens that are about to be sold, filthy killing floors, just terrible. But that's something that we're trying to eliminate, but is very hard to do.
Thank you. Liz, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think probably a lot of people in this room know about zoonotic disease now and emerging zoonotic diseases and the risks there. But again, I'll talk about the known risks already in the animals we commonly keep, because that's the issue that I'm working on the most and the most passionate about, is that there are like 70% of novel diseases originate in animals, and so that's a serious concern. But we're already ignoring these known risks like salmonella. So salmonella you're at risk of contracting it when you interact with a reptile, an amphibian, or a small mammal. And salmonella actually exists in the digestive tracts of healthy reptiles and amphibians, but it can be very serious if a human contracts it. And often it's not, but it can lead to illness and death, especially with children under 5, pregnant persons, and elderly people, to the point that the CDC actually it says on the website, if you have a child under the age of 5, don't keep reptiles and amphibians in your home. But who does the pet industry market frogs to and aquatic turtles to? They market them to children. And there's not a great, so in some states, and I can't recall if New York is one, they have requirements that posted next to where the animals are being sold, saying there is a salmonella risk. But I think it's become so commonplace that people don't take those risks very seriously. And I know, if I have small children, I would have adopted a frog and not known it, and I would have been like an animal lawyer with an adopted frog with my 3-year-old, exposing them to salmonella. And it sounds funny, but children have actually died, and that's why in the 70s the FDA banned these what we call tiny turtles, so turtles less than, I'm going to get it wrong, it's 4 inches or 3 inches. So it is a serious problem, or a serious risk, rather. I wouldn't say that it's extremely prevalent. But these are the kinds of health risks that we continue to ignore, and I think ignoring welfare, ignoring conservation, public health is another important reason that we need to regulate this industry.
Yeah, Becca, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is all super important, and I'll just add two sort of like layers on top. One is that there are animals being caught in the wild from all over the world and brought in. And so we have these wet markets that, you know, we see publicly, but literally JFK is some kind of wet market as well, with all of these animals coming in, and some of them are staying there for over a week, in really stressful conditions, in close quarters, many different species. Most of them, like I said, are going to commercial purposes afterwards, so, you know, presumably for pets. And that is, you know, essentially a petri dish for creating new diseases. It's not great. And then the other point I'll make as well is that we know that when animals are stressed, when their welfare is poor, as these transportation events will induce in them, they have like a higher disease burden, they have a higher disease load, and then they're shedding more disease as well. So like the stress of the animal is accelerating and amplifying the potential for the diseases to be spread and then mix around in these sort of like close quarters, in, you know, from animals, again, from all over the world. It's a major health risk for the creation of, you know, also new diseases or newly transmittable diseases. It's very risky for our public health as well.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next topic, which is law and enforcement and policy. But first, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this question about risk, and that is the risk to the environment itself. What are the conservation risks? What are risks to ecosystems, say from escaped animals? How big of an issue is this, and is this something that we really should be concerned about?
Yeah, it's an issue that we should be very concerned about because the pet trade, the wild pet trade, is one of the leading causes of invasive species. So I don't like to use the word invasive, but that's the term of art that makes people understand what I'm saying the fastest. So most animals, first of all, abandonment of wild animals is a big problem. There's not great data because how would you track it exactly? But we know constantly animals are being abandoned. We see stories all the time, like in New York City. I don't know, has anyone heard of May May? She was a budgie, a parakeet, who was seen flying around Central Park since, I think, August. She was flocking with sparrows. Thankfully, she was rescued last week, but if she had not been caught, she would have been killed because it was going to be winter. So that's not a conservation risk so much, except for May May, because she was at danger. But other species who do escape or are abandoned can have quite the impact. So Assemblymember Rosenthal mentioned red-eared sliders. They're a big problem, especially in New York City. Red-eared sliders are on the IUCN's list of top 100 most invasive species because they're very good at adapting to the environment they find themselves in. And they start breeding and reproducing and altering the ecosystem until it impacts negatively other animals. So in New York City, the red-eared sliders are pushing out painted turtles, for example. They're also creating these huge algal blooms in Central Park ponds, which means there's not oxygen and nutrients for plants and invertebrates who need it. Yet they're sold all over the place. You also have in New York City monk parakeets. They're also called Quaker parakeets, and they escaped or were abandoned decades ago and have actually, even though they're from like the subtropical areas of South America, they do really well in the winters here. So they've established colonies, especially in Brooklyn and Queens, and I wouldn't say they're as big a conservation risk like as the red-eared sliders, but electrical companies don't like them because they build these huge stick nests, so then they build them in telephone poles. So like New Hampshire has prohibited them, and the state of New York tried to kill all of them in the 70s, but obviously were unsuccessful. So I think you have the conservation risk to the animals who live there, and then also when they say like we're going to eradicate or remove them, what they mean is kill animals. That, when states embark on these programs, they mean kill them, and it's usually not in very pleasant ways. So I think, those both sides of the issue.
Thank you. Becca, you had a response? Or?
I'll
Yeah.
just add very briefly that also, with the response that the humans have to an animal that now is a new animal in this area, doing well, being labeled as an invasive species, some of the common killing methods are, laying down poison, which, doesn't, behave well in the sense that it's not just going to kill that one animal, it's going to get into the whole ecosystem. And you can even have bioaccumulation where it gets more and more concentrated as you go up the food chain, and then threatening, other animals and just the whole entire function of the ecosystem. So it's a real Pandora's box.
Sure. Linda, you'll go get a
I
response.
just wanted to mention New York State owns a farm where they raise pheasants so they can be killed. And we put a lot of money into the budget every year so that hunters can learn how to hunt and have fun killing pheasants. I try, maybe someone can help me, to stop that. There's no need for the state to be complicit in this kind of activity, but they shoot them and the bullets have lead and other toxins to the surrounding animals and flora. So it's a bad activity all around.
Wow. That's terrible. I wasn't aware of that. That's really interesting to learn about. I want to move into the sort of core, I guess, of this event, which is the legal and policy frameworks that currently govern wild pet ownership and the pet trade. So I want to direct maybe this question to Liz. Could you walk us through some of the current laws and policies surrounding pet ownership in New York? What are some of the gaps that you see?
So to me, the biggest gap in the law, and this is in most places, but it's also in New York and New York City, is that these laws are largely based on the perceived danger or risk that an animal poses to humans. So I actually wrote down New York City's code. It says, a wild animal is deemed to be any animal which is naturally inclined to do harm and capable of inflicting harm upon human beings. So under that framework, it's really clear, tigers are on one end of the spectrum, hamsters are on the other. But whether an animal is dangerous to humans really has no bearing on whether that animal is wild or whether they're happy as to be someone's companion. I think another big gap, and this is particular to New York, is that legislators and advocates can't really, we can't meaningfully regulate the ways in which these animals are produced because it's happening out of state. So as I mentioned, the budgie mills, those are all in Oklahoma. There are no licensed bird mills in the state of New York. They're mostly in Oklahoma, California, Texas, Florida. So if you want to protect these animals, the only recourse is often on the sales end.
Thank you. Linda.
In New York State law, the definition of wild animal is limited. It covers non-human primates, big cats, wild dogs, wolves, coyotes, bears, venomous reptiles, and large aquatic reptiles like alligators and crocodiles. So that's the legal.
That's the official New York State definition.
Yes, and I have a bill to expand that.
Yeah. Well, on that note, then, could you
yeah.
talk to us a little bit about the bills that you've sponsored? And talk a little bit maybe more about the challenges that you face in moving this legislation forward.
Okay, so that particular bill would be expanded to include kangaroos, wallabies, capybaras, sloths, and other animals that should not be kept as pets, but are. That would include, it would include these animals under the existing prohibition of wild animals being kept as pets, which has exemptions for research facilities, but also for wildlife rehabilitators, sanctuaries, and exhibitors licensed under the Federal Animal Welfare Act. A person who keeps wild animals can be ordered to surrender their animal to local authorities, can be fined up to $500 for the first offense and $1,000 for second and subsequent offenses. There was a case of a sloth where it was like a sloth sale factory run out of a pool supply store where people could go in and pet and interact with sloths and kangaroos. The owner was hit with multiple fines, but not for keeping the animals. It was for not having the proper permit to be operating a petting zoo and violating the Town of Islip's code. So HSUS, which is now the Humane World for Animals, did an undercover investigation, and they found the owner spraying the sloths with water and aggressively grabbing at their neck. So the owner eventually closed the store, took his business to Florida, but any of these kinds of endeavors that can open up at any point, and it's not illegal per se. So we have to expand our laws, but also expand the punishment, which is sometimes even more difficult to do than passing the law in the first place.
Right, right. So that gets into a separate issue. It's one thing to have a law in place, right? It's another thing to enforce that law. And so I guess I was hoping to hear a little bit more about how do local, state, and maybe even federal regulations interact when it comes to exotic pets? How does that landscape make it easier or even more difficult to coordinate enforcement work? And are there like any notable enforcement gaps that are making progress particularly difficult? Liz, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, the biggest gap, again, this won't be a surprise, is the Federal Animal Welfare Act, and that's the law that regulates, the primary law that regulates animals in the pet trade. But of course, it sets minimal welfare regulations, and it's chronically under-enforced. So, for bad actors, violations are ignored, or the USDA issues warnings or issues these negligible fines that don't deter the activity. And we see this like with bird mills. Birds were only recently included. It was a very long legal battle, but now bird facilities are being inspected, and we can see the inspection reports. So one that kind of keeps me up at night is there's a mill in Oklahoma where in 2024, the USDA just went in there for a regular inspection, and the barn was 111 degrees. So thousands of parrots, a barn with 111 degrees, dead birds all over the ground, birds in the process of dying. And I FOIA'd the records, and I got videos back, and they're just heart-wrenching. But of course, there's no accountability. The mill continues to operate. So I suppose that's not a challenge in terms of New York, in terms of sort of working with other agencies. It's more that there's an agency that's asleep at the wheel, that's leaving, animals vulnerable to all this exploitation. And of course, the Animal Welfare Act doesn't include most of the animals in the pet trade: reptiles, amphibians, arachnids, hermit crabs, fishes, and that leaves them vulnerable to extreme suffering. I think especially when you include fishes in that, you're talking about scales of suffering that's akin to factory farming. That's what's going on in these industries. On the other side, on the importation side, there's the Lacey Act, which does say it prohibits the importation of animals under inhumane conditions, but again, that's not enforced. And it doesn't even set out conditions for species other than mammals and birds. So I think when you look at it as like a New York policymaker or New York advocate, you're looking at just huge gaps. And so it's not so much a matter of trying to work together, or it's more that you need to set up a whole new structure or change the system and to be able to protect these animals.
The puppy mills are mostly licensed by the USDA, so it shows how hard it is to get a license and be regulated. But in New York, we have the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, so they have a handful of inspectors. Certainly not enough to do their job, and certainly not enough to do one-off things like there's an alligator in my neighbor's bathtub, and some of that is under Department of Environmental Protection. They have some jurisdiction, but many municipalities have dog control officers who are just some guy. No training. We had a case near Albany where there was a raccoon who seemed to have a disease. It was disoriented, and the guy just like shot him in the parking lot. They don't have training. They're allowed to do basically whatever they want, and it's unimportant to put in place trained individuals who will care for the animals when they're sick and dying, instead of just eradicating them as a problem to humans.
Right, so it sounds like this problem exists on both sides of the story, right? On the one hand, you have gaps in federal legislation and federal enforcement, in the actual trade itself, the breeding and sale of these animals. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you also have, what happens when these animals actually end up in someone's home and they're not supposed to be there, and it becomes a policing effort. And it seems like there is a lot of, not only are there gaps, but there is also, it seems like sometimes there's some gray area about who it is that is actually responsible for addressing this issue at any given stage. And so I guess with that in mind, and this question is directed to both Liz and Linda, but what do you see as the most promising opportunities for reform, whether that is through legislation, enforcement, public pressure, better coordination? What are like the low-hanging fruit, and what are the most like optimal steps that we should be taking next?
So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're working on laws that prohibit the retail sale of animals. I mentioned there's the law in West Hollywood, and actually that same week, Easton, Pennsylvania passed a similar law, and that was by Pennsylvania Voters for Animals, which we supported. And then there's 3 cities in Massachusetts, Beverly, Arlington, and Cambridge, plus Washington, D.C. They all have these expanded bans now. And again, in New York City, we're focused on the retail sale of birds. And I think these are so promising because it avoids questions about, so we're not going in trying to take away people's animals. We're really focused on the cruelty of these mills. And I think that's a story that people understand because a lot of people are familiar with puppy mills, so they understand, they have some awareness that animals are being mass produced. I think it's also a really positive solution because we know, and actually this is different than puppies because most dogs today are not obtained at stores, but most wild animals are obtained at pet stores. We know from pet industry surveys, a really comprehensive survey that's expensive and done every few years that we pay for to access, we know most people get these animals at stores. So it's a really, I think, like for policymakers, that's a really strong argument. And something that I haven't brought up today is also the impact of these sales on the shelter and rescue and sanctuary communities, because all of them are in crisis. Shelters, we know, are in crisis with dogs and cats, but also the other animals are too. And I work really closely with foster parrots, which is the closest accredited bird sanctuary to New York City. It's in Rhode Island. And there's just too many birds coming in, and that's because most people aren't prepared to care for birds. So they buy a parrot, they buy a cockatoo, and now you have a bird who's screaming, who's self-mutilating, plucking their feathers, who's biting. So these animals get abandoned. And another issue is birds are particularly popular with older people, and when they move into assisted living, there's no place for these birds to go. So I think these retail bans are a concrete solution that are really positive and offers some hope for also the humans who are suffering in this wild trade.
I think one element that will be helpful if it's listened to and followed is humane education. And there are laws mandating humane education throughout elementary school and beyond that are not followed. So if you learn at a young age more about animals, you will develop more empathy for them. One thing we have in classrooms, and I got a lot of pushback when I tried to ban the chick hatching. It's like, oh my God, my kids love that. And you bring the hatched chick home and you don't know how to care for it. And it's just a bad thing. kids aren't learning, they're learning how to be cruel. So I think if we start off young enough, perhaps that would lead to more conscious adults. But I think right now, banning sales is the way to go, because we don't have the money for enforcement or the will, and just stop it here, and that will, in turn, stop the demand as much, and et cetera, how it goes, how we try to do, and are successful with the cat, dog, and bunny ban.
Thank you. Yeah, you discussed the importance of public education, not just about the wildlife as a species, but also about their specific needs. And I think this also goes back to Becca's comments earlier when it comes to fish welfare, is that we just don't know enough about their needs to really be able to provide them with the care, with any certainty that we're providing them with care that they need. And so I guess this sort of like segues into the next question, which is what motivates people to keep wild animals as pets? And Linda, you've talked about this, but the role that education and outreach, how can that play a role in shifting behavior? And are there other strategies maybe we should be considering outside of the law?
I can respond to that. I think, some psychology research suggests that one of the main things people want to talk about when they come home from a vacation and share photos is of the animals they saw. I think that we are very drawn to the other beings on this planet. They provide us with a great sense of meaning and belonging and wonder and awe. And if we could figure out as a society how to channel that instinct, that motivation, that calling into ways that are productive and actually working for the animals, not working against the animals, I think that there's like a real, sort of like built-in potential for goodwill. I mean, it is always sort of like quite interesting to think about the people who are bringing these animals into their homes are like, think of themselves as animal people. Even a lot of these people who are running the mills that are generating the animals are thinking it like probably the sloth owner was thinking, they are drawn to animals and in a unique way and in a strong way. So figuring out ways to sort of like channel that in more appropriate and healthy ways for the animals as well. And, the rise of birding, for example, but just sort of creating cultural practices and norms and expectations about ways to sort of share our joy and love of animals that doesn't involve like oppressing them and harming them. I think it could be a productive win-win way forward.
Great. And Liz?
So in that survey I mentioned, it also had a lot of helpful data about what motivates people to purchase animals, and they do it by category. They have fishes, small mammals, reptiles and amphibians as one category, and birds. And the number one motivator is fun to watch / have in household. And companionship is up there. Teaching small children responsibility is popular, especially with the small mammals, which is obviously a particularly bad idea. But regardless, it is. But so fun to watch, have in household. And that's what's so heartbreaking about that is people don't really know what they're watching. So it's just, it surrounds us, these wild animal sales. We grow up and we see turtles and tanks at pet stores, and then we watch programming like children's shows. Like now my children watch Peppa Pig, and I had this idea that all the media my children would consume would be very pro-animal, and I don't think it can be done, honestly. I would like to talk to like a parent who has done that. Because all children's programming has, fishes in tanks, has bearded dragons in tanks, and I think when you grow up with that, you think a parrot can be happy in captivity, and the only way to change that is, kind of a few ways. One, and I don't think it can just be public education. I don't think that'll be enough. So one way is kind of changing the way we can access animals, and again, through these retail bans. But the other is through, like Becca's work, is educating people, like glass surfing is a stereotypic behavior in reptiles, and they are not happy. But it looks maybe kind of cool, and maybe people are like having fun watching that. So I think, I don't know how fun, I don't think most people think it's fun to watch an animal suffer, but I don't think people realize what they're watching. So I think it's that kind of information.
It's like the polar bear some years ago in Central Park that was neurotic because of it was kept in this very small area, swam back and forth all day. And then they gave Prozac, and I mean, it was just not normal. There wasn't kept in a beneficial situation. I think some people learned from that, unfortunately, from that animal suffering. But you know, zoos and aquariums are places where animals suffer. But one bill I've been trying to pass for many years, and I have no success, is including cruelty to wildlife in the definition of what constitutes aggravated cruelty to animals. And, you know, I can make no headway on that. And that's because the people, you know, lawmakers have some agency, but it becomes wildlife belongs to no one, as I said earlier. And we have other things to do. So it's hard to get any animal legislation through in general, but wild animals are like untouchable. And I feel that that sets an example. It's fine to, you know, shoot an arrow at a swan because, you know, it's just mischief, it's misdemeanor. And so we, you know, we do have to have stricter laws. Like all the animal laws are in the ag and market section of the law, not in the penal code. So they're not, and one lawyer involved in all this said, well, we don't want them to take it as seriously as crimes against humans. And that's a very old way of looking at things, but that is the current status.
That's very disheartening. And I imagine that this attitude towards wild animals as something that is to be conquered or something that is part of nature, it shouldn't be elevated to the status of humans. I imagine that could create a lot of difficulty in your work.
And there is a divide. You know, New York State is broad and different, and so hunting and fishing, like rah, there's a lot of that going on. So against that backdrop, it's hard to try to protect wild animals. You know, I and my colleagues have been successful at protecting companion animals, but you know, wildlife and others that are not cute, adorable, have a harder time.
Well, thank you to all three of you. I want to move into audience questions, and so I want to open up the floor if any of our members of the audience here in person or online as well. I think we've had a couple of questions come in. Now will be the time to raise your hands. Okay, yes, yeah.
Very good, thank you. Assemblymember Rosenthal, thanks first so much for your leadership on animal issues. This question, my apologies, isn't so much about either wild animals or companion animals, but Liz did bring up earlier the situation of egg-laying hens. And I know that you've introduced a bill this year, as well as in 3 other legislative sessions.
Many years.
Well, many, more than that, yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, like, clearly you care about, like, the
Yes.
6 million egg-laying hens in this state. So, like, I'm wondering how you're approaching this issue going forward. Clearly, you must be having some sorts of problems with this bill specifically to introduce it so many times and have it go nowhere. So, like, how are you making it a priority, and how is it specifically challenging? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I do keep reintroducing. Every 2 years we start a new cycle, so I reintroduce bills that I haven't passed in the past. So I'm against the battery cages. When I first introduced it, the head of the Agriculture Committee was a farmer, and there's something called the Farm Bureau, which is farms belong to, it's an industry group that you'll see we've passed no laws protecting farm animals because they're a strong group that opposes all of it. So that farmer, Bill McGee was his name, who was the chair, and he's died. But we had a round table. All the people involved in the egg-laying trade came with beautiful pictures of the big cages and how free they were in there. I keep trying to educate my colleagues, but it's like an establishment position, do not touch them. But you just have to keep trying. I know that the HSUS had tried a while back to craft a nationwide ban on those. I don't think it was what it needed to be, and I think it's still a problem. But I try to push everything I introduce, and some catch on, and some you have to keep going. But I do think you see a lot more cage-free hens, eggs. Like you see a lot more vegan cheese, for example. I do think the message is spreading, and I think young people, kids, are like, I don't want to eat an animal. So I feel more positive about the future. But it's very difficult. It's industry. I introduced a bill banning CAFOs over 700, which is the federal definition. You can't believe, girl from New York City telling us what to do? So I have a reptile skin.
We have a question from an online attendee tuning in from Scotland who is currently studying animal welfare science and plans to go into animal welfare law and wants to have as much positive impact as possible at perhaps even the national or international level, and is looking for advice about how to do that effectively and how to get involved in a way that can have a good impact. So I would like to divide this into a couple of questions. One, and I would love to actually pose this to Adeline as well, because you do a lot of work locally and internationally, is if you could say a little bit about how the different scales of government work together and what type of advocacy makes sense, or what type of change to push for makes sense at local versus national versus international levels. And then maybe for anyone who wants to speak to it, how can one, either professionally or as a citizen, get involved at advocating for effective change at different levels of government?
Sure, yeah. I mean, my first bit of advice when I get this kind of question is always call your representative and vote. It is so important that you, especially in a place like the US where we are electing representatives who are supposed to represent our interests, it's important that you communicate what those interests are to those folks. And in my experience, at least, they can and will be very responsive to that. If there is a particular issue that you think needs to be addressed through legislation, that is something that you should be communicating to your representatives. Separate from that, at least at the international level, it's a little more difficult, I think, at the international level, but there are plenty of civil society organizations that are constantly engaging in these kinds of issues alongside member states. And so one way to get involved at that stage is to reach out to those civil society groups. There are often events that you can attend, public campaigns that you can participate in, and just voice in numbers always helps. And so when groups like that, show up to these multilateral large negotiations, and there is that power in numbers, and so that would be my response to the question.
I like the voting.
Yeah.
Actually, people who care about animals are like the single most emailing, calling group. They are often single issue voters. And Curtis Lewa would have gotten a lot more votes if they hadn't tried to tell people not to vote for him, because they're animal voters. So I think that's great. I was thinking about years ago, we passed a law banning shark fin soup. And it was a moment. And I think that's why I also introduced some of these bills, because you never know when the moment will strike. So that was like everybody was upset because they were shown visually how the fins got into the soup. The poor sharks, it was just... Also, there are nationwide organizations that work on like model bills. So you try to do it in many states. Maybe you do it in New York or California first, and then it spreads to other states. So the same is true internationally. You know, there are a lot better laws outside the US, in the EU, in terms of animal testing, in terms of like, no one declaws a cat outside the US. So, you know, we can learn from them, take inspiration, but also campaigns can spread across the world.
I just add briefly, and then Adeline can call on the next person in the room. Part of why we focus on local policy in the Wild Lab at the Wild Animal Welfare Program is that we do think local policy is this really important and neglected lever that not enough people are trying to pull. Obviously, the national and international level is very important. National level provides legal authority and regulatory coherence and resources, of course, for local action. International policy is needed to coordinate national and regional activity, and it can have symbolic value, of course, too. But local policymakers are often much more accessible to their constituents, and cities can often be policy innovators and policy incubators. They can take the lead on novel approaches to certain types of policy issues and then model that, normalize it. And so I think for folks who do have an ability to engage at the local level, that can be really, really valuable, and I think it deserves consideration. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes.
Thank you. Does this work? Awesome. Microphones are scary. Yeah, so thanks for the talk. You did mention different sort of practices that ideally should be banned and work towards that. I just wonder, how does it play into that work, sort of an assessment of the risk that the same things could be done illegally and in an even worse way? So is that a risk to even consider, or are practices so bad already that any bans are good?
Or so like you're talking about like a black market?
Yeah.
Yeah, a black market would be created. Yeah, that is the number one argument that people who oppose these retail bans make. It's there's an organization that used to be called PJAC, which is the Pet Industry Lobby, but now they've rebranded. They're called the Pet Advocacy Network, which is very confusing to legislators and very confusing for everyone. And that is the argument they made when we worked on the law in West Hollywood. They had meta ads running for weeks saying that all animal sales will be pushed to a black market. But luckily, it's a really easy argument to refute because there is no meaningfully regulated market for wild animals right now. The enforcement is so bad, the conditions, the minimal requirements are so low that to say that some kind of regulated good market exists is pretty outrageous. Further, also because it's only for mammals and birds, the reptiles, amphibians, fishes, they're already in this so-called black market. So no, I mean, I think that's a question we should take seriously. We certainly don't want to make things worse, but I think in the current state in the US, that's not something that concerns me, but yeah, worth thinking about.
Anyone else want to respond?
I mean, I did get that with the pet store ban, the black market. And so the legal definition of breeder, we're discussing changing that to make it a smaller number is a licensed breeder, because there are many backyard breeders, there are many Amish breeders, there are many breeders that continually have their animals produce more, and it's very hard to regulate all of those though too. But I agree. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Say your name first. Yeah.
You talked about humane education as a way of like changing the culture around this, but unfortunately, probably a lot of schools are keeping bearded dragons or fishes and using them to teach humane education. So kind of ironic there. Is there any legislation about prohibiting keeping wild animals in schools or resources to help teachers teach humane education?
I mean, there are plenty of resources. I know that the teachers union has a whole curriculum. You know, it's not like a special 45-minute period dedicated to humane education. It can be woven into every lesson. You know, you have 5 birds and, you know, like math, English, everything. You can weave it in. That would qualify. I do have the bill banning the chick hatching in schools. I told you the reaction I got. I don't know about, you know, bearded dragons and all of those. I think, you know, they're in Petco, so you can just buy them and use them in school. But I will look into that part.
Wraps up our event. Big round of applause for our panelists. Great. Thank you all for being here.